All right, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see everyone. My name is Rabbi Adam Freiberg. I'm the assistant rabbi here in the Young Israel of Hollywood, Fort Lauderdale. It was a pleasure to help put together this series. Unfortunately, I missed the first one. I was a little under the weather, and then we had a cancellation on the second one. So after many months and a lot of work, it's a pleasure to finally be able to learn with all of you tonight. Just before Rabbi Poupko starts, I just want to briefly introduce the book we're going to be talking about. And to do that, I actually want to turn to some thoughts that Rabbi Sachs himself, Rabbi Sachs Zatzal, spoke about in his Haggadah. Obviously, we know Rabbi Sachs wrote a ton, and Pesach is upon us in just a week and a half. And in Yachatz, one of the steps of the Seder, the splitting of the middle matzah, we take the middle matzah and we do exactly that. We split it. Now, of the three matzot, the upper and lower represent the Lechem Mishnah. We know every Shabbat we have two chalot to represent the double portion we got in the desert, and the top matzah and the bottom matzah represent that. It's Yontif is true on Yontif and Shabbos, and Pesach is a Yontif. And so that represents a double portion of man that fell for us. The third matzah, which is actually in this case the second, the middle matzah, represents the special chiyuv, the special obligation to eat matzah is unleavened bread on Pesach. And there's two reasons presented for why we break it in half. The first is that it's described as the lechem oni, the bread of a poor person. And someone who's poor, he doesn't know where his next meal is going to come from, right? He doesn't know if he'll even have food later. And so therefore, anything he has, even the smallest piece, he breaks in half. Some now, and he saves some for later because he doesn't know where his next meal is coming from. And the second reason given is that with the destruction of the temple, matzah takes the place of the Korban Pesach, of the sacrifice that was brought, the special sacrifice, the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb that was brought every Pesach. And just as that Korban, just as that lamb was eaten at the end of the meal, so to experience it as Kodesh, as holy food, not just food to satisfy our hunger, that's the meal, but the Korban Pesach was something unique and special, so too we reserve half the matzah, the afikomen, to be eaten at the end of the meal. However, there's also a third significance to breaking the middle matzah. And that is that matzah represents two contradictory ideas. At the beginning of the Seder, we describe it as the bread of oppression that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. And the Ibn Ezra, one of the Rishonim, explains that the slaves were given this unleavened bread, this matzah, that they actually eat it well before they were free, because it's hard and it takes a long time to digest. It was a cheap way to feed their prisoners. And so the Egyptians fed the Jews matzah while they were enslaved. And later in the Seder, we describe this matzah as the bread that the Jews, the Israelites, ate as they were leaving Egypt, that they were in too much of a hurry to have time to allow the dough to rise. And so perhaps, Rabbi Sachs suggests, we divide the matzah in half to show both, to symbolize both of these contradictory ideas. Right? The difference that at the beginning, it represents the bread of a slavery, and at the end, it represents the bread of freedom. And that the difference between freedom and slavery lies not only in the quality, not in the quality of the bread we eat, not in the physical thing, it's the same piece of matzah, but in the state of mind in which we eat it. In Rabbi Sachs's book, which we're going to discuss tonight, that we so look forward to Rabbi Poupko's presentation, A Home We Build Together, Rabbi Sachs speaks about the different models that society can choose to adapt when dealing with the issue of people of diverse backgrounds, of coming from different places around the world who are now going to live together. As we think about that, we should forget that our state of mind, the state of mind we choose to adapt, is sometimes even more important than the actions. The action can look the same. It could be the same piece of matzah, or the experience we have can look the same. But our attitude, the way we choose to think about it, can make all the difference. So with that short introduction, I look forward to hearing Rabbi Poupko's talk. Rabbi Poupko, for those unfamiliar with him, for those joining us from my shul and other shuls, Rabbi Poupko is a senior rabbi of Ahavath Torah in Englewood, New Jersey, and we thank him so much for joining us this evening and for sharing words with us. Rabbi Poupko, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Freiberg. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for all your work putting together this wonderful series. I want to give a special shout out to my dear friend, Rabbi Yosef Weinstock. It's great to see you. We were together on a program last week. I haven't seen your face so much in a long time. So this is all good stuff. Before I begin, I'm just going to put in the chat, I'm going to be sharing my screen to show you, to go with you, some of the excerpts from the book that I'll be using. But I just put into the chat a link if you want to just bring up the file, download the file yourself. So you can either use the link, but I will be sharing my screen so you can follow along directly on the Zoom. I have some introductory comments first, and then when I get to the excerpts that I want to talk about, I'll share my screen at that point. The Home We Build Together is one of my favorite books of Rabbi Sax's, and I think it's not as popular as some of his other books, but it's really one of my favorites, and you'll see why in the course of my talk. There's a podcast that I listen to occasionally. It's called Conversations with Tyler. It's a podcast hosted by Tyler Cowen, who's an economist. He's a polymath, and he has such a real talent for asking really educated questions from his scholarly guests on such a wide variety of topics. He knows exactly the right questions to ask. And what's fascinating is that each episode begins with an intro that says that the theme of the podcast, it's meant to bridge the gap between academic ideas and real world problems. That concept of bridging the gap between academic ideas and real world problems, real world issues, I think is a good way to approach this book of Rabbi Sacks and perhaps much of the thought of Rabbi Sacks in general. Because on the one hand, Rabbi Sacks was a philosopher, a thinker, a great rabbi, someone grounded in the world of ideas, abstract ideas, Torah ideas. And yet, as a teacher and a writer, he clearly meant for his ideas to address real world problems. And he knew how to apply these ideas to real world issues. He wasn't just teaching Torah Lishma. He wasn't just teaching to inform and to inspire and so that people should be educated Jews. He wasn't just getting people to think. For all of that, we could have said Dayenu, because he did that in such a masterful way. But he was also teaching in a genuine effort to impact the world, to change the way individuals and societies looked at themselves and how they conducted their affairs in the Jewish world and beyond. And he did this with his ideas drawn from Jewish thought and secular philosophy. This book that we're discussing tonight, The Home We Build Together, I believe is one of the better examples of this endeavor. It offers real solutions based on Torah ideas to challenges facing society today. It's described in the Dust Jacket as a successor to an earlier book of his, The Dignity of Difference, which I know Rabbi Weinstock's older brother, Rabbi Eli Weinstock, spoke about first in this series. So I'm sure all of you were at the first one, but perhaps I'll just summarize and review quickly just a few of the main points of The Dignity of Difference in order to show how The Home We Build Together builds upon that book. In one phrase, The Dignity of Difference, in that book, Rabbi Sacks demonstrates how different cultures can learn to appreciate one another. It was written in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. In short, Rabbi Sacks argues in this book that we need to move beyond tolerance and coexistence and more actively embrace and appreciate our differences. Differences between peoples and cultures, they aren't just mere realities. They aren't just obstacles to overcome, just the opposite. They are values. The differences that exist between us are things to value and to cherish from a religious perspective. There is a value in difference, a dignity of difference, as the book is called. And his primary argument is based on the fact that that's how Hashem created the world. Hashem designed a world marked by diversity. And so if Hashem wants this world to have diversity, then it must be that diversity is a good thing. And in that book, The Dignity of Difference, I won't review it too much, but he focuses on the story of Migdal Bavel to show how Hashem rejects a monolithic, uniform society in favor of a diversity of identities and backgrounds. I'm just going to quote a little bit from the book because it's so helpful for what we're going to be talking about tonight. Listen to the following. The first verse of the story begins with a very striking phrase. He's talking about Migdal Bavel. The whole world was of one language and shared vocabulary. The whole world was in a state of unity. And the question is, what was wrong with that? And it was here that, in writing my book, Rabbi Sachs writes, I relied on a remarkable interpretation given by one of the great Jewish scholars of the 19th century, known as the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who said an extraordinary thing. He said Bavel was the first totalitarianism. It was the first place that had no room for difference. And in another quote, Rabbi Sachs writes, the Bible is telling us that one of the greatest sources, perhaps the greatest source of human evil, is the fear and even the hate towards those who are different from me. It is that fear and hatred of difference that has led historically to violence, to war, and yes, to genocide. Bavel represented a society without space for difference. One language, shared thoughts, no difference. And he goes on, and one of the best demonstrations of his argument in the dignity of difference is how he talks about how the Torah only tells us once, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Because your neighbor, your friend, the person like you, it's easy to love that person, relatively speaking. But Rabbi Sachs points out, as do others, in over 36 places does Hashem say one has to love the stranger. 36 times more, the Torah tells us to love the stranger because it's much harder to love the stranger. It's much harder to appreciate and to embrace someone who is different than us. There is an inherent fear within people of that which is different and that which is strange. And so the Torah mandates that not only do you have to love the stranger, but in looking at the story of Migdal Bavel, the Torah is demonstrating that Hashem designed the world in such a way. He scattered everybody in order that there should be different identities. And there's a value in it. This is the way the world was supposed to be. That is the dignity of difference in short. The home we build together takes the foundations of the dignity of difference, this idea of valuing, of cherishing diversity and difference, and builds a practical framework on that book. I mean, I don't think it's a pun to say the home we build together is building something on the foundation of the dignity of difference. So allow me now to, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go on a little bit more and then I'll share my screen. The home we build together is basically a prescription for how people of different cultures can live together in a shared society, a society that respects cultural and religious diversity, while at the same time promoting civic equality, social cohesion, and a sense of the common good. Why is this even a question? What's the problem? So Rabbi Sachs explains that both the problem with society and its solution can be described with a parable of three homes, three different types of homes. And one thing that's important to note is that this book is written addressed to the United Kingdom. He's writing about British society, but this book can easily be applied to other Western societies, and Rabbi Sachs in later talks essentially says that. But in order to understand why it is such a challenge, why it's such a challenge to build a society with different people from different cultures. So he uses these three metaphors, these three types of homes. Imagine, if you will, he says, that you have 100 people who are wandering the countryside looking for a place to stay. And as they're wandering around, they come upon a very large country house. This is the first type of home, the country house. This group of 100 people, they knock on the door and the owner comes out and they say to him, "We need a place to stay." And the owner says, "Absolutely, be my guests, come on in. I have a very large home. I have plenty of room for all 100 of you." And so this country house provides a place for strangers to live because there is a benevolent host who is willing to have them. But one thing to understand about this country house is that the host is the owner and the guests are just that. They are guests. That's one model, the country house, and we'll come back to it. The second model, imagine the same 100 people, but instead of wandering the countryside, they're walking around a big city and they're looking for a place to stay again. This time they're in a big city, they find a hotel. And this hotel has everything they need and it's perfectly affordable to them. So this group of 100 people, they check into the hotel. And to live in this hotel, the rules are very simple. They can do what they like as long as they don't disturb the other guests. The relationship that these guests have with the ownership of the hotel is purely contractual. It's a contract, right? You sign when you check into the hotel that you will abide by these rules, and they will let you stay in this hotel. Clearly, this hotel offers freedom and equality like they did not have in the country house, right? In the country house, there was an owner, and the guests are subject to the whim of the owner. The owner can kick them out whenever they want. But in the hotel, they have a contractual relationship. They have certain rights. They have restrictions on what they can do, but they also have rights. And so the relationship between them and the owner of the hotel is different than the relationship that they had with the owner of the country house. The problem with living in a hotel is a hotel is a place where you stay. It's not a place where you live. Nobody puts down roots in a hotel. Maybe some former presidents, but other than that, nobody puts down roots in a hotel. There's no sense of loyalty. There's no sense of identity. And when you live there, you don't connect with other people, with the other hotel guests, right? Everyone just kind of does their own thing. If you stay there a while, you may start to recognize some of the people, but you're essentially strangers vis-a-vis the other people who live in the hotel. These two models, the country house and the hotel, represent successive stages in the history of Western societies. This is what Rabbi Sachs demonstrates in the first section of the book. Until the mid-19th century, societies were like the country house. And the owner of the country house represents the dominant culture of that country, perhaps a monarch, perhaps a monarchy, but it was one dominant culture. And if you were going to be staying in that country, if you were going to be living in that country, you either belonged to that dominant culture or you didn't. You were a stranger. You were either an insider or an outsider. And if you were a minority or an individual and you wanted to belong, you had to lose your own identity and assimilate into the dominant culture. If you didn't assimilate or you couldn't assimilate, then you had second-class status. You were a guest in the country house. And writing in the context of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Sachs points out that until 1829, Catholics could not attend university in Britain. They could not get a degree, they could not enter government service or parliament, and Jews had to wait much longer. They weren't part of the dominant Protestant culture, and if you weren't part of the dominant culture, you were a guest in that country house. If we wanted to think about an American analog, and again, not everything translates, but the fundamental ideas do to other Western societies, the notion of a melting pot. It used to be that in America, you were expected to melt your identity into a common American identity. Obviously, that has expired at a certain point. But that's the model of the country house. The hotel model, which says that minorities don't have to give up their identities in order to belong, it's because there is no concept of belonging. Right? In the hotel model, there is no dominant culture. There is no present owner. I mean, the hotel has an owner, but in terms of those who are managing the hotel, right? There's no present owner. There's no dominant culture. There's no national identity. There are no outsiders there, and because there are no insiders. The hotel, everyone's essentially equal, and it basically represents multiculturalism, where you have many different cultures all living side by side, and everyone is, and the idea is to live and let live. All right, in a hotel, everyone stays in their own room. Right, you may recognize some of your neighbors, but you don't really get to know them. You don't become part of the city. You don't mend your rooms together. Does this work? This is the hotel model. Multiculturalism is what developed after the decline of the country house dominating culture model. The more people started moving around, the more people started emigrating to other countries. And it really reaches its nadir in the 1960s in England and around a similar time in America. During this time, you have an influx of immigrants coming to England. Again, Rabbi Sachs is writing in the context of England. You have immigrants coming from the Caribbean, from India, from Pakistan, West Africa, refugees from communist countries. And England became, as America was as well, a multicultural society where everyone was encouraged to maintain their native culture. Does this work? Rabbi Sachs asks. No, it doesn't work, because it eventually leads to a certain amount of segregation. When you have different people all staying in their lane, no one feeling like they're part of any sort of national identity, then you end up certain groups end up with more power and more clout than other groups, and there's a certain natural segregation that happens, or sometimes there's a legally enforced segregation. Keep in mind, it wasn't until 1964 in America when the Civil Rights Act was passed that segregation became illegal in this country. Multiculturalism, it sounds good, but in practice, it's still vulnerable to segregation. It made me think of another book I read called The Big Sort. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this book, The Big Sort. It was a book written by journalist Bill Bishop in 2004. And based on demographic data, he showed how Americans here in this country have been sorting themselves into homogenous communities more and more. That people are no longer defined by region or by state, by city or by neighborhood. People choose to live around people of their own lifestyle and beliefs, which results in a country that's very polarized. And he was writing this in 2004. I mean, just think about how polarized we are now. But that's the idea of the book, The Big Sort. The Big Sort is basically just a natural tendency towards segregation. Some would argue that segregation was helped along by certain forces in society. But at the end of the day, multiculturalism is vulnerable to people all staying in their own camps, all congregating amongst people of their own similar identities, and not really finding any sense of shared identity. And that's what Rabbi Sachs points out, that teaching everyone to remain different, to remain unique, without some counterbalance of fostering a shared idea, what that essentially means is that everyone's relationship to society is contractual, right? As long as you guarantee me my rights and I can live the way I want to live, I don't feel anything more responsible to a national identity, to a national project. And that's how a society becomes like a hotel. Quote, you pay the price, you get a room, you're free to do what you like, so long as you don't interfere with the other guests. And that's basically what's happened in England and in America and other societies. The fundamental problem Rabbi Sachs is pointing out is that a hotel is a place where no one is at home. No one feels a sense of loyalty to a hotel. How many of us just leave the towels on the bathroom floor? We would never leave a towel on the bathroom floor in our own bathrooms. But there's no loyalty to a hotel. We don't care about it as much. We don't feel invested in it. And there's no identification with the history, the language, the culture of the host country of the hotel. You know, there's something remarkable in a lecture that Rabbi Sachs gave in 2008, reflecting on some of the ideas of the dignity of difference, not the home we build together, the dignity of difference. He made the following comments. This was in 2008. It says, we had in Britain our own 9/11. We call it 7/7, July the 7th. It happened on the 7th of July, 2005, when 4 suicide bombers struck. And those 4 suicide bombers had lived in Britain, were educated in Britain, worked in Britain. They had friends and neighbors and colleagues, none of whom had the remotest suspicion that they were terrorists. They were shocked when they discovered the truth about who they thought they were, these nice, decent, quiet people. The only thing they noticed different about them was that they had become very religious. And yet after 7/7, those terrorist attacks, not only did they realize, and we realized, that these people were prepared to die and prepared to kill innocent civilians on their way to work, it also became clear in the videos that they left behind that they had a violent hatred of Britain, everything Britain and America stood for, by way of freedom. And what Rabbi Sachs was saying in this quote and in that speech is that this is the extreme of the failure or the vulnerability of multiculturalism. That some people who maintain their identity in a particular country feel no loyalty, no allegiance to it whatsoever, and in its most extreme form, feel a sense of hatred and act out in violence towards it. With so much ethnic strife in the 90s and the aughts and thereafter, clearly multiculturalism wasn't working. It was still keeping people apart. One other aspect that Rabbi Sachs points to in contributing to this decline of multiculturalism is the fact that morality has been largely based on individual autonomy, on rights, what individuals are entitled to, and there's very little dialogue given to some sort of universal moral code that would bind people to each other with responsibilities. Liberal democratic societies are more focused on the laws that keep us from encroaching on one another, but there isn't necessarily a focus on ways in which we can connect people with one another. So all of this creates the hotel model of society. And that's what happens when people retain their own identities and they don't communicate and don't connect with the other groups of people, then they can end up turning against them. And by the way, technology, telecommunications, social media, the internet only exacerbates this. It allows individual groups to further isolate themselves from the rest of the national identity. So how do we overcome multiculturalism and its vulnerabilities? How do we recreate a society? That's the third model. The third model, right? The first one was the country house. The second one was the hotel. And the third one is the one which I want to share on my screen. Again, I put in the chat a link if you just want to download it for yourself. But I'm going to share my screen right now so that we can follow along in these book excerpts that I prepared here. Okay, so the third, if you see in the red box on the left, page 14, the third, 100 strangers arrive at a town. There they are met by the mayor, councilors, and local residents. The mayor says, "Friends, we welcome you. It is good to have you among us. Sadly, as you can see, there is no country house where we might accommodate you," right? There's no place where you're going to live for free, nor do we have a hotel. There is, though, something we can offer you. We have a patch of empty land large enough to accommodate homes for all of you. We have bricks and building materials. We have experts here who can help you design your homes, and we will help you build them. Meanwhile, we will offer you hospitality while the homes are being built. Let us do this together. And so it happens. Unlike the country house, the newcomers have to build their own long-term accommodation. Unlike the hotel, they do not merely pay. They invest their energies in what they build. Their relationship with the place is not purely contractual. They helped build it. It is their achievement. It is of their making. That means they can never be entirely detached from it. What we build embodies something of us. And this reminds me of one of my favorite Gemaras. There's a Gemara in Bav Metzia which says, Rotze Adam bekav shelo, yoser mitisha kabin shel chavero. A person would rather have one measure of produce that they brought out of the ground with their own blood, sweat, and tears than 9 measures of produce given to them by someone else. Something that you bring into the world yourself, you have personal investment in. And that's the idea that Rabbi Sachs seizes upon and utilizes here for this third model. Because now, instead of people just landing in a place and being given a place to live, one which they don't feel an attachment to, this model talks about people building their own homes for themselves. I'm skipping to the bottom paragraph on page 14. This is a more demanding model than the previous two, but it also yields more. The newcomers feel, as they did not on the country house model, that they have earned their place in this, their new home. They have a self-respect that was not available to them as guests. And unlike the hotel model, they have a real relationship with the people of the town. They have worked together on the plans. They have labored together in the act of building. You'll see labored is spelled for British people, not for Americans. It's got a U in it. They have the sense of being part of a team that comes when any group, friends or strangers, work together for an extended period on a constructive project. I could read this whole page to you. It's just the words flow so beautifully, as we know Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Sachs for. I'm skipping to the last paragraph in the red box. The newcomers still occasionally seem strange. They speak and act and dress differently from the locals, but those long sessions of working together have had their effect. The locals know the newcomers are serious, committed, dedicated. They have their own ways, but they have also learned the ways of the people of the town, and they have worked out a modus vivendi, a rough and ready friendship. The two groups respect one another with that unspoken regard that comes when you work with others on a shared project to which each brings his or her own special guests. The highlighted lines, making something together breaks down walls of suspicion and misunderstanding, even though that is not the aim of the project at all. The aim of the project is to have a place to have a roof over their heads. But by building that together, that is society as the home we build together, the title of the book. So that's the third model. The first one, again, was the country house. The second was the hotel. The third one is the home we build together. And obviously, it's this model which enables us to overcome the vulnerabilities and the dangers and the failures of multiculturalism. Because in this one, people now form a relationship to the place that they live in. They now feel a connection. They put something of themselves into this entire endeavor. And what does this do? Next page, page 16 in the red box. The third model, the home we build together, values the identities of both the majority and the minorities. It says we are different, but that does not mean there is nothing to bind us in shared belonging. What makes us different is that we are. What unites us is what we do. And that's what's so important, because what Rabbi Sachs is arguing here is that by doing, by working together, not just carrying our identities with us, but literally creating something together, that is binding. That is what can bind people together. We create the common good. Society is not static, but dynamic. It is not just something we inherit and inhabit. It is something we make. The more different we are, the richer the possibilities of what we make together. We all bring our own ideas from our own cultures and blend that together into something new. That means seeing difference not as separation, but as contribution, right? That word difference, that's the dignity of difference. Yes, we have our private rooms, but we also have our public spaces, and those public spaces matter to all of us, which is why we work together to make them as expansive and gracious as we can. The act of making, the highlighted lines, that act of making creates belonging. When people have a share in making something, there's a sense of belonging. This is society as integration without assimilation. Remember, assimilation is the idea that there should be a melting pot and everyone should have a shared identity. That never happened, and it never will happen. But you can still integrate people together, even without assimilating them and having them lose their identity. Because in addition to their own personal identity, culture, and background, they also share something that they built together. Now, to ground this idea, to provide a foundation to this idea that when people work to create something together, that's a different kind of model. So Rabbi Sachs marshals two ideas from the Torah. One of those ideas is the concept of covenant. And we know that Rabbi Sachs uses the concept of covenant in many places. And his very, very well-known Parsha series is Covenant and Conversation. Covenant is very, very important in the thought of Rabbi Sachs. And I'm sure whenever somebody does a rigorous analysis of the thought of Rabbi Sachs, there will be at least one chapter, if not many, on the concept of covenant. That's one concept, the concept of covenant, the concept of bris. The second concept, the most important one for this book, is the concept of the Mishkan. The Mishkan, the tabernacle that the Jewish people built following the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So let's take a look at the concept of covenant. What does covenant do? Well, how does covenant help us understand this approach that Rabbi Sachs is suggesting, this home we build together? So if you look at the red box on page 108, covenant is one of the three broad types of political system. Polities come into being in one of three ways, right? Polities, the way that we organize and govern a society, right? These either conquest, slow growth and development, or formal conscious decision. The first tends to produce a hierarchical society, right? Conquest. The second, an organic one, it's like slow growth and development. And the third, society as covenant. What's society as covenant? Look at the next red box, page 109. The third kind, covenantal society, is formed in a conscious act of new beginnings. The parties come together to achieve what neither can achieve alone. I'm skipping the parentheses. In an act of covenant, both parties agree to respect one another's integrity as free agents. This is so even when one of the parties is God himself. The key element in covenant is neither power nor the past, but a verbal declaration, a mutually binding promise. Covenantal politics is supremely a politics of the word given, the word received, the word honored and trust. And now the highlighted line, so important. The parties to a covenant bind themselves to one another in an open-ended bond of mutuality and loyalty. They agree to share a fate. The concept of covenant means that I bind myself, I commit myself to you, and I accept your commitment to me. One of the most famous lines of the Bible epitomizes this sentiment. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? Psalm 23, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Unlike contracts, which are about interests, covenants are about identity. They turn a plurality of I's into a collective of we. The simplest example of a covenant is marriage. Friendship can also take this form. The Bible tells us that Jonathan made a covenant with David and Jonathan, because he loved him as himself. The prophet Hosea gives a striking account of Hashem's covenant with his people as a kind of marriage, right? Erastich li leolam. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice and love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will know the Lord. Covenants and contracts are different things and address different aspects of humanity. He's making a distinction between the concept of a contract and the concept of a covenant, which is very important because liberal democracy is based on the concept of the social contract. But what Rabbi Sachs is arguing for is something beyond that, built on the concept of covenant. Last line on 109. In a contract, what matters is that both gain. In a covenant, what matters is that both give. Remember, the home we build together, we're contributing. Contracts are agreements entered into for mutual advantage. They are undertaken by individuals or groups on the basis of self-interest. By contrast, I'm skipping a couple of lines, covenants are moral commitments, and they are open-ended. They are sustained not by letter of law or by self-interest, but by loyalty, fidelity, and faithfulness. Next paragraph, social contract creates a state. Social covenant creates a society. Social contract. We know the concept of social contract from modern political theory. Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau all developed approaches to the concept of social contract, which made sure that people got along, that countries functioned, at least in theory. But that doesn't create a society. That doesn't create a shared identity. That doesn't create a shared commitment. That's what covenant is all about. Now, before we get to the next source, What's the best example of a covenant in the Torah? The Torah itself is a covenant. Ma'amad Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah in Har Sinai was a bris, was a covenant of commitments that Hashem and the Jewish people made to each other. Chazal see it as a wedding, just like the language of Hosea that we just read a moment ago. That was a building of a covenant. It wasn't a contract. I give you this, you give me that. No. It's an agreement of shared commitments. Hashem commits himself to us, and we commit ourselves to Hashem in this shared destiny that is the Jewish people. And so what comes right after the giving of the Torah? The building of the Mishkan. And this is what is so brilliant. This is what blew me away when I read this book for the first time from Rabbi Sachs, how he uses the concept of Mishkan so beautifully to demonstrate a compelling philosophical idea that addresses real world issues and offers solutions for real world issues. I'm reading too much, so I'm gonna jump around. So stay with me. So in the red box on page 136 and 137, there is one detail I've deliberately saved to last. Read the book of Exodus and you will see that the early chapters are all about politics and freedom, right? That's the first half of the book of Shmos. They tell of slavery, oppression, yada, yada, yada. We all know that. But then the second half of Shmos, that has nothing to do with Exodus. It has nothing to do with redemption. It's all the details of the Mishkan. And so Rabbi Sachs asks the question that everyone asks: why does the Torah give us all of this detail for the building of the Mishkan? And so if you look at page 137, the second paragraph, the Hebrew Bible is, as already stated, a political as well as a spiritual text. This is an important line because Rabbi Sachs is being very honest about how he's reading the Torah. He's reading it for its political implications, its political messages. Despite the miracles, the essential narrative is remarkably human. The Israelites are portrayed as a querulous, almost ungovernable group. Moses' deliverer comes to them with the news that they are about to go free. His first intervention, however, only makes things worse, and the people complain. Right? So he has all those troubles. Next paragraph. Some 6 weeks later, at Mount Sinai, they receive the great revelation. God speaks directly to the people. They make a covenant. They make a covenant with him. And then what happens next? Next paragraph, putting all this together, we arrive at the boldest of all Exodus's political statements. A nation, at least the kind of nation the Israelites were called on to become, is created through the act of creation itself. Not the sea, manna from heaven, or water from a rock. Not even the revelation at Sinai itself turned the Israelites into a nation. In commanding Moses, here's the money quote, in commanding Moses to get the people to make the tabernacle, God was in effect saying, to turn a group of individuals into a covenantal nation, they must build something together. The Mishkan brought the Jewish people together as a nation. How? By having them all contribute to a shared project. Kol asher nadva rucho, everyone generous of spirit, everyone with their talents and skills and materials, they can contribute to the building of the Mishkan so that they would now, this home, this center of their nation, the home for God, would be something that they were all invested in. They all put something in, all gave a machatzis shekel, all built that Mishkan together. That's the home they built together. Such a beautiful use of the Mishkan to demonstrate how we can move beyond multiculturalism, beyond just different cultural identities. By getting people to build something together, everyone now invests in that shared common project. Page 138, I'm just going to read the highlights. Here then is the source of the title of this book. I love it when an author tells you why he called the book he called it. Here then is the source of the title of this book. Society is the home, the tabernacle we build together. Right? A country is a country, a nation is a nation. Society, what we experience every day in the collective of the people around us, society, that's our home, and it's something we all build together. It was built out of difference and diversity. It represented, next highlight, orchestrated diversity, or in social terms, integration without assimilation. That is the dignity of difference, the title of the other book that this is built on. The tabernacle is a symbol of society. Just as God creates the natural universe, so are we called on to create the social universe, right? He points out, as many else do, that the Torah has very few psukim describing the creation of the world, and many, many more psukim describing the creation of the Mishkan. Because Hashem created the world and gave us the raw materials. but it's up to us to build a society within that world that he gave us. Okay, so just to sum up a little bit for what we have now, these two concepts of covenant and Mishkan are the concepts from the Torah that Rabbi Sachs uses in order to make this very, very compelling, rigorous argument for how we can take societies made up of many different peoples from many different backgrounds and bring them together for a shared national identity without erasing their differences. Finally, the last excerpt, the whole concept of covenant and Mishkan, is the second section of the book. In the third section of the book, he offers very practical, pragmatic ideas grounded in philosophical concepts of how to go about that. And I wanted to read more, but I'm definitely taking too much time reading. But what I just want to show you here, what's in front of you on page 176 and 177, is there was a study that was done by taking a whole bunch of kids and putting them into a group and seeing, from a state of nature, how well they would work together. And of course, what did the study find? That when they gave the kids a shared project, they were able to work together. And in the bottom of 176 and into 177, what Rabbi Sachs is demonstrating is that what is going to inspire people or teach people how to work together is not broad, grand utopian ideas, right? The Navi Yeshaya envisions a time when the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat. But the prophets are not pragmatists. Who are pragmatists? The rabbis in the Talmud. And so he quotes from the Talmud towards the top of page 177 about concepts of Darkei Shalom, seemingly prosaic enactments that make sure that people are caring for other people. And so look at the last box on page 177. The reason was that the rabbis were not utopians. Without losing sight of the end of days, they legislated for the here and now. Without relinquishing the prophet's dreams, they translated them into codes of practice, learnable behavioral norms. They put their faith in education. They brought heavenly ideas down to earth, creating a redemption of small steps. They took a realistic view of humanity. They acknowledged human failings and found ways of turning them to good purposes. Even if people initially do good for ulterior motives, said the rabbis, if they do it long enough, they will eventually come to do it for its own sake. The prophets spoke poetry, the rabbis prose. But the rabbis succeeded where even the greatest of the prophets failed. When it comes to realizing high ideals among ordinary human beings, choose non-utopian solutions. They are more effective and more humane. And in the next box, he quotes the Navi Yirmiyah. The Navi Yirmiyah gives advice to the Jews going into captivity. And what does he tell them? Take the city's welfare as your own, as I highlighted. Right? People should seek out ways to contribute to the society in which they live in. They should continue living their lives, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce. Bottom highlight, the way of peace are a code, right? Darkei Shalom are a code of good neighborliness, active citizenship. And it's this idea of active citizenship that I'd like to talk about for just a moment as we conclude here. Because what Rabbi Sachs essentially suggests, and obviously it's fleshed out in greater detail in the rest of this book, is that in order to realize this concept of building a home together, people have to work on projects together. People have to actually build things together, just like they built a Mishkan, just like they built those homes in that third model of the 100 people. And that what people need to realize is that they need to find ways to connect to other communities by doing things together. The best example is like a community garden, and Rabbi Sachs mentions this. Imagine taking a whole series of different peoples all living in the same city and having them create a community garden in the center of their city. Now everyone becomes invested in that shared project, in that shared identity. And people of different faiths and different ethnicities and different races can all keep their identities while contributing to this community garden. There's a phrase people use: all politics are local. I would adapt that based on what Rabbi Sachs is saying, and to say that all society is local. all community building is local. That to achieve what Rabbi Sachs envisions is for us to turn to our neighbors, the people who live near us, and look for ways to connect, not just to dialogue, but to work together, to do something together. You know, when I read this book, I think about, you know, what goes on in certain well-populated Jewish communities where Jews have a strong presence and therefore are active, rightfully so. They're active in town councils, they're active on school boards, and very often this becomes a point of friction because we all have what we think are our rights, right? What we're entitled to. We're taxpayers. We should have a voice. We have a vote. We need a seat on this board. We need a seat on that committee. And all that's true. But the reason why in some cases it leads to divisiveness is because we don't have a shared identity with our neighbors. Or at least some of us don't. And that those same people who live in a different part of town, who we only see at city council meetings, or we only see them, you know, at certain points, people from outside of our Jewish community, if we were to turn to them and find other ways to interface by building things together, then we would learn more about each other. We would feel invested. We would feel like we have the same broader community. We could still maintain the necessary insularity of our Orthodox community. There's a certain value in our insularity. But at the same time, we'll be able to move beyond it by having another identity on top of that one, an identity of something that we build together, the home we build together. And so I would just say in conclusion, you know, for Rabbi Sachs, one of the things that made him such a great thinker, first of all, is that he was a postmodern thinker. He was able to critique modernist ideas like the social contract and the personal autonomy, not in a way that was destructive, not in a way that tore them down, but in a way that shows their weaknesses and what we can build on top of those ideas. Personal autonomy is important. Freedom of religion is built on that. The social contract is important. Societies cannot thrive without laws that maintain the social contract. But if we stop there, then we're not building a shared society. He was able to build upon those modern ideas in order to provide something much more advanced, something much more sophisticated. And finally, Rabbi Sachs is one of the things that made him great is that he was able to take ideas and values found in the Torah and apply them to real world issues. He's a thinker, but I got to tell you, this book to me, it reads like such a practical formula for not just coexisting, but connecting and thriving with people who are different from us. And that's part of our mission as Jewish people, to be an Or L'Goyim. Imagine being an Or L'Goyim by sharing our light and enhancing our light together with the people around us. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm happy to take questions if anybody wants to chime in or throw something into the chat. But I really, really appreciate Rabbi Freiberg and Rabbi Weinstock for putting together this one. Really enjoyed. And again, if anybody has any questions, I'm here. I'm not here all night, but for those of you who have to go, thanks for joining. Great to see you.
Yasher koach, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Yasher koach. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
Any questions?
Okay. No.
Excellent, Rabbi.
Thank you, Sonia.
Rabbi, thank you. It was excellent. I really enjoyed it. And I've taught multicultural education at the university level, and I really appreciate what you said.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Donna.
Excellent. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.